Hi everyone, I'm John Whitty. Welcome to another edition of New Jersey Business. Coming up today, sexual harassment. It continues to be a major problem in corporate America. We'll learn about preventing sexual harassment before it starts. Also on the show today, spring is in the air, but that means tax time is not far off. So we've got a tax time doubleheader for you today. We'll look into estate tax planning a little bit later on, but first up, Sheldon Pollack is here to discuss tax reform and 5 common tax myths. Sheldon, thanks for being here.
Nice to be with you, John.
You're an associate professor of business law at the University of Delaware.
That's right.
So you obviously know what we're talking about here.
A little experience with tax.
My viewers won't appreciate hearing this, but myth number 1 that you disprove or argue against is that Americans are overtaxed. You feel that's not true?
Well, I wouldn't argue for sure that Americans aren't taxed enough, but rather that it's not necessarily the case that we're overtaxed. There's a figure going around, a lot of Republicans are bandying a figure that we're at the highest rate of tax since the post-war era, but that's not necessarily true. It depends on who you are. In fact, for the great majority of the middle class, tax rates have been very constant for the last 10 or 15 years, and in fact have been reduced for the lower income brackets. It's really the wealthy who are paying more taxes in the last 10 years. Whether they're paying too much taxes, that's a different question, but their tax rate has increased in the last 10 or 15 years.
In fact, that's myth number 2, is that the rich, you know, in the common view, don't pay enough tax.
Yeah, everyone thinks that everyone else is getting away with something, but they're paying taxes. And clearly, a lot of people think and argue politically that the wealthy aren't paying their fair share. In fact, it's really the wealthy who've picked up the slack. Since 1981, tax rates were reduced dramatically for the wealthy, but they've increased particularly on the wealthy in the last 10 years. The top 1% of tax bracket on taxpayers are paying over a third of the federal income taxes. And the top 1%
of the income earners are paying 33% of the income taxes.
The top 5% are paying over 50%. So most of our tax revenue comes from wealthy people. That's why the Republicans have been pushing for a 10% flat tax across the board. Democrats have responded that that only benefits the wealthy, but that's natural because the wealthy are paying the taxes.
Yeah.
There's no tax refunds for people who don't pay taxes.
This topic is going to become more and more apparent as we get closer to the next presidential election, correct?
Yes, it is. Now that a couple days ago Steve Forbes announced he's running for president.
He's the big flat taxer, isn't he?
Big flat tax plan. It plays a little less central role, I think, in his campaign this time around. Wasn't the real big winner. But he's coming back with the same reform for a flat 17% tax rate. And we're going to hear the same sort of arguments that we should abandon the federal income tax. Before we do that, we should remember that, first of all, we ran the surplus for the first time in 30 years in fiscal year 1998. And that's because the income tax really did so well. The economy is booming and the income tax is bringing in far more revenue than anyone predicted. And at the same time, the income tax raised over $1 trillion. That's very hard to replace and just abolish the income tax and replace it with a flat tax system.
Very tough. And we'll get into the tax code in a minute. But tax myth number 3, that corporations don't pay enough.
Well, there's figures that float around showing that the burden of tax by corporations has decreased dramatically as a percentage of federal revenue. In fact, that's mostly attributable to the fact that the income tax and the Social Security payroll tax are bringing in so much more of our revenue. The corporate taxes has declined as a major source of federal revenue, but that doesn't necessarily mean that profitable corporations don't pay taxes. Most of the big tax loopholes were eliminated in 1986. In your book, The Failure of U.S. Tax Policy, I believe you address the unfairness, basically, of the Social Security tax. Well, a lot of people don't realize, but about 3/4 of Americans actually pay more in Social Security tax than they do in the income tax. That is the most significant tax for the majority of American citizens. And that's a very different tax. It's not a progressive tax. It's a tax that's at a flat rate, and it really does affect the working classes and lower income persons.
Because it's a constant percentage.
Because it's a constant percentage.
Right.
And on top of that, it cuts off. It cuts off at about $74,500, so that someone who's making $150,000 pays exactly the same as somebody who's making $75,000.
Right.
And so that's a huge source of our federal revenue is coming from the payroll tax.
Interesting, yeah. although it continues to go up. They continue to increase the amount of income subject to that tax.
Yes, dramatically, much more than a minor adjustment. On top of that, the tax rate has gone up, Social Security, from about 3% up to, if you include both the employer-employees portion, 15%, over 15%.
We're not going to have a chance to get through all 5 tax myths, but how, in your opinion, can we go about reforming the tax code to make it manageable and more friendly to the taxpayer?
Well, I don't think any major radical reform proposals have a political chance and probably would be unwise. The best we can do is incremental, minor tinkering at the margins to make some of the onerous provisions in the tax code a little easier for the average taxpayer to confront. We've done that a little bit. We made it easier to calculate your capital gains this year compared to last year, and that's the kind of reform we need to reduce the amount of time it takes the majority of citizens to fill out their tax return.
I'm with you on that. Sheldon Pollack, Associate Professor of Business Law at the University of Delaware and author of The Failure of U.S. Tax Policy. We're going to take a short break, but stay with us. When New Jersey Business continues, we will look at the tax season from estate planning and so forth, so stay tuned.